Hey everybody, back again, another set of notes. So we're gonna jump right to it. Shrink this down real quick, and we'll jump right into this set of notes. We're still on Module 1, which is Ecosystem Dynamics and Interactions. Um, However, now we're going to look at Lesson 2. So here's the goals for Lesson 2. I'll let you read through those. Basically, it's similar to Lesson 1, but we're gonna move on and we're gonna start looking at some more details what we were originally covering. So the title of this note is Population Size and Resources. So we're looking at how resources can affect population size, and we'll talk about a couple different types of resources. We'll talk about abiotic resources and biotic resources. Abiotic resources and biotic resources. And we'll look at those two types, how they can affect population size, and then we'll couple that with some of the other information that we've already learned. So we'll do a quick review before we jump into the new stuff. So reviewing from lesson 1, right? Populations normally level off at some point. We learned about that. We learned that this point where it levels off is called carrying capacity, and that it levels off because there's limited resources. These can also be known as limiting factors. So limiting factors are things like the availability of food, habitat that they can survive in. It could be abiotic factors as well, like if you're a plant, how much sunlight you're getting, or how much water is available, or how many nutrients are in the soil, and so on. So this is kind of like a real life or death game of musical chairs. Um, for example, I think what I said in class was if you have an area that has, 15 bunnies that are living in a particular forest ecosystem, and there's 45 coyotes in that ecosystem that want to feed on the bunnies, well, some of those coyotes aren't going to have enough resources to eat, right? So some of the bunnies, or a lot of the bunnies, might end up dying, but also some of the coyotes might die because there's so many of them and they're not going to have enough food. So these factors, again, could be biotic, living, or abiotic, non-living factors within an ecosystem. And we'll go through that and talk about what each one is. Okay. We will also explore how population size is impacted by these different biotic and abiotic factors, how they're interconnected with one another. We'll talk a little bit about inter and intra-species competition and look at how that works. And we'll talk a little bit more about logistic growth as opposed to exponential growth. So last little bit to review, we talked about carrying capacity and what is basically what ultimately determines the size of a population. But there are other influences, and we talked about disease can have an effect on populations. So disease can spread through a population, especially ones that are highly or have a high density. In other words, a lot of organisms kind of in a small confined space. We talked about predation. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And then competition, that's the big one we're going to talk about. And we actually have a virtual lesson that we're going to look at that kind of deals with that. I'm sorry, a virtual lab. So these factors are dependent on several things as well. The proportion, right? How many predators could impact the amount of, how many prey and vice versa. The prey can also affect the predator population. The scale, the size of the population, and then quantity, amount of resources. How much do we have available? How much, area do we have to live in? How much habitat do we have? How much nutrients are available in the soil, and so on. All right, so that kind of takes care of our review. So let's start looking at these limitations to population size. And we talked about abiotic and biotic factors. So let's move into the abiotic first, and we'll go through this rather quickly. And then we'll move into the biotic factors as well. So abiotic factors that limit population are factors that are not alive. Abiotic simply means not living. Biotic would be alive, abiotic not alive. These factors stop the exponential growth of populations because of the intraspecies competition or interspecies competition, either one. So let me give you a couple ideas. So when we're talking about interspecies or intraspecies, we're talking about it could be competition within the same species, right? So You think about the bighorn sheep, and sometimes you see those pictures where they're butting their heads together while they're competing, or basically kind of trying to establish which male is the alpha male for a particular area. And it could be um, they're having this competition, or yeah, basically competition over living space. It could be habitat, or it could be mates. But that's an example of competition within the same species. You could also have competition between different species. Um, you could have multiple organisms visiting the same water hole, and trying to get that limited resource, which is water, or even plants of different species, oak trees, as well as any rose bushes or other shrubs that might be in the area, competing essentially for the same nutrients and water and sunlight and all that stuff. In order to limit competition, some species have actually um, basically kind of compartmentalized. It's called partitioning. Um, their habitats, their niches. This is where a species would divide the niche to avoid competition. So anole lizards in the Caribbean are a great example of this, and we'll look at it on the next slide. But basically, you have a whole bunch of very closely related lizards called anole lizards, which basically have divided up their niches so they're not in direct competition with one another anymore. So let's take a look at this diagram on the next page, and I'll kind of explain it a little further. So if you're taking a look, and I'm going to grab my pointer here, right? If you're taking a look and you have different species, the A here is for the anole lizard, but you have different species. The genus is the anole, and then you have these different species that are found in different locations. And really, what we have is we have about 5 different species that may exist in the same forest. However, how are they able to survive and cut down on the competition? Well, they stay restricted to a particular space. Some of these species, right, are way up in the tops of the trees, okay, and they survive up in the tops of the trees, and they feed off of the insects and the food and the stuff that's available up there. While others might be down in the trunk area, they might be surviving in the middle part of the trees, and still others are going to be way down near the floor of the forest, and they'll be surviving off of insects and bugs that spend most of their time on the floor. So you can see how they all live in different, basically the same ecosystem or the same location, but they have different niches, right? They will spend time up in the canopy and feed off of insects that maybe are up in the leaves and feeding off the leaves of the plants, while others might be down on the trunk or the floor and feeding off of insects that are in those areas. So they're able to kind of share the available resources by dividing up or compartmentalizing their niches within that same ecosystem. All right, so what are the limitations of population size? We're going to continue on. So here's some more abiotic factors that can limit population size. Sunlight, this is especially true with plants. They have to compete to have access to amounts of sunlight needed for photosynthesis to take place. Actual location, space, or land. So the available space to grow and live is competed for and becomes a limiting factor as well. Climate, right? The temperature and the amount of precipitation limits the size of a population. Water, the availability of water, how much water is needed for survival is another important abiotic factor. Probably the most important one for some scientists, because if we're ever looking for example, life on another planet, one of the very first things we look for is the availability of liquid water in that location. Humidity, another abiotic factor. Soil makeup, how much nutrients are in the soil for particular, this important for certain types of plants, okay? The pH, either of aquatic ecosystems or of the soil, again, for plants. Shelter. Now, shelter's a little bit different than space. We talked about space on the previous page. Shelter could be protection, okay? So how many rocks, if you have an insect that likes to live underneath rocks or in protected spaces, how many rocks are available for them to kind of have this shelter to protect them from either harsh weather or predators or whatever. So it's not necessarily just space. It could be actual shelters from different organisms. Now, there is an exception to this. If the shelter is actually in a living thing, for example, ants living inside acacia trees, because the tree is a living thing, that would no longer be an abiotic factor. It would become a biotic factor. Okay. All right. So let's move on to biotic factors now. Biotic factors that limit population size are factors that are alive. That's the term biotic, right? These factors, like abiotic factors, can stop exponential growth of a population. And again, it's due to a lot of times because of intra or interspecies competition. So let's look at a few of these biotic factors. The biggest one, and the one that most people usually think of right away, are the relationship between predators and prey. The number of predators in an area can limit the amount of prey. So again, if the predator population is way up and there's more organisms that are feeding off the prey population tends to go down because they're getting eaten. Okay, and you actually see, and there's going to be a couple graphs and stuff that we look at, not in the notes, but for some of the exercises we do in this lesson, where you can see this interesting relationship where as predators go up, prey is dropping down, and then as predators start to drop back down because maybe they've run out of food, the prey starts to go back up, and you have this interesting fluctuation between the two populations within a graph. So the number of predators can affect the prey population. The number of prey can affect the predator population. So they're kind of directly related to each other. Amount of food, this excludes plants. They don't need to go find or search for food because they make their own. So it would become more of an abiotic factor, the amount of sunlight, how much photosynthesis they can do. The number of competitors for limited resources, and this could be, again, interspecies or intraspecies competition. How many organisms are looking for that particular food source, or how many organisms are visiting that common watering hole to get water. So those are other things that are biotic, right? The competition. All right, so let's move back to carrying capacity. We kind of introduced this in lesson 1. We'll move back into it in lesson 2 because it's such an important topic, right? So what happens when limiting resources are reached? The population growth will either do one of two things. It'll either come crashing down if the population gets too high over carrying capacity, it'll have to come back down, or it'll start to level off. It'll slow down and kind of level off, and you might get this kind of wavy line with it kind of moving along carrying capacity, but so it could go a little bit above carrying capacity, a little bit below carrying capacity, but it's going to level off somewhere near carrying capacity. An example of a population crash is going to be shown on the next slide. So we'll take a look at that, and I'll kind of explain it, and then I'll read through the description off to the left of it. Oops, wrong way. There we go. So in this graph, you see deer population. That's the number of deer on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis down here you have time. Okay, the red line represents the deer population. So as deer population is going up, it can get up and it can get above carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is this dashed blue line. So once it starts getting up above carrying capacity, okay, if it gets above this for too long, what's going to happen is the population has to get back down. And a lot of times it kind of over adjusts. It'll drop down below, oops, sorry guys. It'll drop down below carrying capacity and then slowly make its way back up. Now notice, carrying capacity takes a dip here, okay? That's probably because this deer population getting above carrying capacity is affecting carrying capacity. So carrying capacity can actually change. It's not always going to be at the same level. It can go up or it can come down. So let's imagine this carrying capacity is food. Maybe this is grass that the deer feed off of. If the deer population gets too high and they're eating a lot of grass, well then the amount of grass is going to decrease and lower carrying capacity. So The deer who are eating the grass start to run out of grass because it's getting lower, right? We're running out of grass. And these deer might start starving, and the population will have to drop back down. Now, once it drops back down, it'll come back up. It'll get at or near carrying capacity. And then you see this kind of fluctuation where you got this wavy line going along carrying capacity. So in this case, deer population, which is shown in the red line, as I just mentioned, grew so fast that it went past carrying capacity. It's represented by the dotted line. Since it shot up past carrying capacity, a population crash had to bring it back down to level, as we mentioned. So then the deer population will start to grow again and level off. And most likely, this is looking at a food source. So it says down at the bottom, most likely they ate much of the food source and the grass was not able to grow back to its original amount, so it lowered carrying capacity. Okay? All right. So how are different populations affected? Not all populations are impacted in the same way. So we got to look at the population itself as well as how it's organized, how densely populated it might be. There's lots of different things that can actually affect populations or cause populations to be affected differently by these limiting factors. So there's a few determining factors in how population will be affected by these different factors. And here's a few things to consider. First one is geographic range. How much land does the species live in? In general, large area is better. It is for, it's basically better for species to survive in. And it increases the carrying capacity of the species. So if you have a large geographic area where organisms can spread out, it usually ends up making for a more stable population within that area. We also have to consider habitat tolerance. This can be very broad or narrow. And basically this tolerance is always a range, right? It's a range of, it could be abiotic factors or other things, other conditions. A lot of times you can think of things like pH, or temperature, or if it's a water environment, an aquatic environment, it could be salinity in the water, and there's lots of different things, right? So in other words, they can tolerate or survive within a certain range of a particular factor, but can't survive if it's too far outside of that range, right? So let's just take a simple one, temperature. Temperature, for example, polar bears survive really well in low temperatures. That's where their natural habitat is. If we took a polar bear out of the Arctic region and moved it into some place that would be in the tropics, like the Amazon or something like that, it wouldn't survive very long. It would overheat, dehydrate, and probably die in a relatively short period of time. The opposite of that is true. If we took some kind of organism that was living in the Amazon and put it up into the freezing cold temperatures where the polar bear survives best at, that organism wouldn't survive very long as well. So we have this narrow tolerance for a lot of these things, and some of them are broader, some of them are more narrow, but usually it's a fairly narrow tolerance that organisms can survive for temperature or salinity or how the pH of a particular environment or whatever. You can name several of those. Local population density is another one. Higher density in areas means that there's a larger number of species living in the area. So you can think of this in human terms. A large density population would be something like cities, right? New York, Chicago, LA, very densely populated. If you have a small density population, that means you have fewer species living in the area. And now you're thinking of places outside the city, right? The suburbs or farms or rural areas where not as many people are living. Generally, the larger the geographic range, the higher the tolerance, or the more broad the tolerance. And having large densities means the species are better suited for survival. Smaller populations with low tolerances and small population sizes can be wiped out easier. So in large density populations, things like disease can spread rapidly and occur more often. But because you have a large number of individuals, the genetic diversity within that population helps ensure some of the population will be more resistant to the disease and be able to survive. If the population is smaller in a dense area, it could actually be wiped out entirely by a disease, which is why when we get populations that are really small, We tend to put those organisms either on protected or endangered species lists to try to protect them a little bit better. Besides disease, other characteristics can also help an organism either survive or have problems surviving. And these different things could be competition, either inter or intra-species, as we've mentioned already. Predation, how many predators are in the area. Natural disasters can affect population size. Yeah, it's usually a little bit more random because they tend to be spontaneous events that can't be controlled, or we can't control where it's going to hit or occur at. Okay. All right. And that brings us to the end. So I just wanted to kind of review the assignments really quick. Make sure you do all the self-checks. Do all the check for understanding quizzes for Module 1, Lesson 2. Look through this slide. There's a certain tab that has an extra little slideshow on scale and proportion and quantity. This is in Module 1, 2.3. Look through that. And then do the assignments. There's 2 assignments, 2.4 and 2.5. Some of you have been turning them in already. That's great. And then do the simulation lab 2.6 on population growth. We're going to go over that a little bit more in detail on Friday. And then there's a discussion board, an additional discussion board on the scale and distribution of populations that you have to respond to. So that takes care of this set of lessons. So we can make sure that we're getting those lessons and everything done. And like I said, some of you guys have already been doing them. You guys that are doing them ahead of time, awesome job. If you haven't done them yet, you have until Sunday for all of the lessons and stuff. Make sure you do the quizzes by Friday. All right, guys? Thank you.